In 1992, a brand new airport opened in western Pennsylvania, and the New York Times called it the airport of the future. It had a futuristic X-shaped terminal, an underground tram, a shopping mall inside the gates, and enough capacity to handle 32 million passengers a year. People were genuinely impressed. So today, we're going to look at the rise and fall of Pittsburgh International Airport, a $1 billion crisis. The city before the airport. To understand what Pittsburgh International Airport became, you have to understand what Pittsburgh was before it. For most of the 20th century, Pittsburgh was one of the great industrial cities of America. Steel was king. The mills along the Monongahela, Allegheny, and Ohio rivers ran day and night, and the city's population and economy reflected that muscle. At its peak in the mid-20th century, Pittsburgh was one of the most important manufacturing centers in the world. A city that built bridges, skyscrapers, railroads, and warships. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers and sent steel to every corner of the country. Then, in the early 1980s, the bottom fell out. The American steel industry collapsed under the pressure of foreign competition, changing global markets, and decades of outdated infrastructure. In just a few years, over 100,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in the Pittsburgh region alone. Whole communities built around the mills fell apart. The population began bleeding from the city. Pittsburgh lost roughly a quarter of its residents between 1980 and 1990, and civic leaders were left staring at a hollowed-out economy and asking, with some urgency, what came next. By the mid-1980s, the push to reinvent Pittsburgh was in full swing. The city invested in hospitals, universities, and technology. Downtown was rebuilt, and when the opportunity came to transform the regional airport into a major national hub, local officials grabbed it with both hands. They needed a win. An airline offered one. That something turned out to be an airline. The original airport, modest beginnings. Pittsburgh's original commercial airport, Greater Pittsburgh Airport, opened on May 31, 1952. The facility sat on about 1,600 acres in Moon Township, was built for $33 million, and in its first full year of operation, handled just over 1.4 million passengers. More than 100,000 people came out during the Memorial Day weekend to tour the new facility, a genuine civic celebration for a city that had spent years watching neighboring cities pull ahead. The early years were unremarkable in the best way. 5 airlines served the airport at opening: Trans World Airlines, Capital Airlines, Northwest, All American Aviation, and Eastern Airlines. TWA was the early heavyweight, operating a small hub at Pittsburgh from the 1960s through 1985. The first jet service arrived in the summer of 1959, when TWA began flying Boeing 707s on a Los Angeles to Chicago to Pittsburgh loop. By 1959, the April airline guide showed 54 daily departures on TWA alone, with Capital running 58. For a regional airport in the late 1950s, those were solid numbers. International status was granted on July 1, 1968, when the airport opened its first customs office. An international wing opened in 1972. In May 1981, TWA launched the first direct service from Pittsburgh to London Gatwick, a notable moment, even if the route only lasted 4 months before the airline pulled it due to poor first-class demand. Then, in 1985, British Airways inaugurated Boeing 747 service from Pittsburgh to London Heathrow, with a stop in Washington. It was a real milestone, a wide-body transatlantic flight out of a mid-sized American city. Expansions came steadily in 1959, 1972, and 1980. But the terminal that had seemed perfectly adequate in 1952 was, 3 decades later, bursting at the seams. Overcrowded, outdated, and struggling to keep up with the volume of traffic flowing through it, the airport needed more than a renovation. It needed a replacement. Something bigger was coming. All American Aviation, the airline that grew up in Pittsburgh. Before U.S. Airways became U.S. Airways, it was something much smaller and, honestly, much more interesting. All American Aviation was founded in 1939 and initially operated an unusual airmail pickup service. Aircraft would fly low over rural communities and snag mail pouches suspended between poles without ever landing. It was exactly as eccentric as it sounds, and it was genuinely innovative for its time, extending mail service to communities that had no airstrip and no realistic prospect of getting one. The operation eventually evolved into conventional scheduled passenger service, and the airline went through a series of name changes that track the arc of American regional aviation. Allegheny Airlines in 1953, U.S. Air in 1979, and finally, U.S. Airways in 1997. Through each identity shift, Pittsburgh remained the carrier's home base and its primary hub. The airline and the city grew together, and by the late 1970s and through the 1980s, U.S. Air had become the dominant force at Pittsburgh International. It controlled roughly 90% of all passenger traffic at the airport, a market share that any antitrust economist would look at with concern, and that local officials looked at with something closer to gratitude. Because here's the thing, a single airline controlling 90% of your market might feel like a partnership, but it's actually a dependency. U.S. Air had enormous leverage over Allegheny County officials who badly needed the city to project economic strength. Those officials were about to discover, the hard way, over the course of about 15 years, that leverage cuts both ways. U.S. Air inaugurated transatlantic service from Pittsburgh with a Frankfurt route in June 1990, flying Boeing 767s. It was a signal that Pittsburgh was operating at a different level than most regional cities of its size. The airline had taken ownership of the airport's identity, its growth trajectory, and, soon enough, its finances. The $1 billion bet. In 1987, with financial backing from U.S. Air, Allegheny County officials launched one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the region's history, a complete, ground-up replacement of the airport terminal. The new facility would be a midfield terminal, meaning the main passenger building would sit between the runways rather than along the edge of the airfield. The design was the work of Tasso Katselas, a Pittsburgh-based architect, and the resulting structure was genuinely striking, an X-shaped airside building with 4 concourses stretching outward from a central hub, flooded with natural light from a glass and steel roof. It was built almost entirely to U.S. Air's specifications, designed to function as one of the carrier's primary connecting hubs. The vision was enormous, capacity for 100 gates, enough land purchased to potentially double the airport in the future, and a projected ability to handle 32 million passengers annually. The price tag came in just under $1 billion. For a regional airport in 1987, that was an extraordinary sum. Construction began. The 2,600-foot underground tram system was installed to ferry passengers between the landside and airside buildings. And on October 1, 1992, Pittsburgh International opened its doors. Operations transferred overnight from the old terminal, and by morning, Pittsburgh had a world-class airport. The Air Mall, a collection of name-brand retailers and restaurants built into the secure side of the terminal, became a standout feature of the new design. Eventually named the best concessions program for a mid-sized airport by trade publication Airport Revenue News. The layout was conceived so that passengers moving through security would walk directly past shops and restaurants, creating a retail environment that worked in the airport's economic favor, regardless of whether travelers were connecting or departing locally. At its peak, the Air Mall was generating tens of millions of dollars annually in concession revenues. The county had issued roughly $600 million in bonds to fund construction. U.S. Air had signed a 30-year lease and was expected to cover the debt through its operations. On paper, it was a sensible arrangement. In practice, the entire financial foundation of the airport had been handed to a single airline, one with a well-documented history of turbulence, pun absolutely intended. No one seemed too worried about that at the time. The golden years. Through the 1990s, the new airport was genuinely thriving, and for Pittsburgh, that mattered. U.S. Air, which rebranded to U.S. Airways in 1997, built Pittsburgh into a major connecting hub. Passengers from smaller cities across the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast would funnel through Pittsburgh to connect to larger destinations. At its peak in the late 1990s, roughly 80% of all passengers at Pittsburgh International were connecting travelers, not people actually starting or ending their trip in the city. That's not a sign of a strong local market. It's a sign of a hub and spoke model running at full throttle. But it generated traffic, revenue, and jobs. And for a city that had spent the early 1980s in economic freefall, those things were not abstractions. By 1997, the airport was handling over 21 million passengers annually, a record at the time. U.S. Airways was operating hundreds of flights a day, employed around 11,000 people in the Pittsburgh metropolitan area, and had inaugurated transatlantic service to both Frankfurt and London Gatwick. British Airways had been flying between Pittsburgh and London for years before pulling out in 1999. U.S. Airways immediately took over the Gatwick route when they left. For a city still carrying the scars from the collapse of its steel industry, having 2 daily departures to Europe felt like a statement about what Pittsburgh had become. In August 2001, Pittsburgh International had its single busiest month ever. 2 million passengers passed through its gates in 31 days. The airport was averaging 633 daily flights and was on pace to set an annual record. U.S. Airways Executive Director Brad Penrod later recalled that at the height of hub operations, the airport was seeing 1,400 to 1,500 operations a day. If you were standing in the Air Mall in the summer of 2001, everything about the airport looked like a success story. The tram was packed. The gates were busy. The retail concourses were generating revenue. Pittsburgh had built a billion-dollar facility, and it appeared, against most reasonable odds, to be working. It would not work for much longer. September 11th and the first bankruptcy. On September 11th, 2001, everything changed. Not just for Pittsburgh, but for the entire American aviation industry. The terrorist attacks on New York and Washington didn't just traumatize the country, they devastated commercial air travel. Passenger demand collapsed almost overnight. Fuel costs spiked. The federal government grounded all commercial flights for days, and when air travel resumed, it did so tentatively, in an industry that was already bleeding money. Airlines collectively lost tens of billions of dollars in the months that followed, and the restructuring of the entire sector began in earnest. U.S. Airways had been in fragile financial shape even before the attacks. The company's routing was inefficient, its fleet management costly, and rising competition from low-cost carriers had steadily squeezed its revenues on the routes where it had once held easy dominance. The airline lost $2 billion in 2001, and the majority of those losses had been accumulating well before September. The attacks were less the cause of U.S. Airways' collapse, and more the match dropped into a room that was already filling with gas. Pittsburgh felt the damage immediately. Within a week of the attacks, U.S. Airways began cutting jobs at Pittsburgh. In 2002, the carrier filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy reorganization. Hub operations continued at a reduced scale, but the trajectory was clear to anyone paying attention. The airport that had been celebrating record passenger counts 14 months earlier was now watching its anchor tenant slowly hemorrhage. The structural problem was the high cost of operating at Pittsburgh. The airport's debt load, a direct consequence of the 1992 construction, meant steep landing fees and elevated per-passenger costs that put U.S. Airways at a competitive disadvantage compared to its other hubs in Charlotte and Philadelphia. By 2003, the airline reported it was losing $40 million per year from Pittsburgh operations alone, while simultaneously covering roughly 80% of the original construction debt, a figure that in today's dollars exceeds $1 billion. Running a hub at Pittsburgh had become, financially, a losing proposition, and everyone involved knew it. The lease cancellation? Completely immoral and unethical. In 2003, just as U.S. Airways was emerging from its first bankruptcy, the airline quietly canceled its leases at Pittsburgh, without any advance notice to airport officials or county government. No warning, no negotiation, just gone. The former executive director of the Allegheny County Airport Authority described the move in a 2021 interview as completely immoral and unethical. It was a gut punch to a city that had built an entire $1 billion facility to the airline's exact specifications. The county had taken on enormous public debt based on the assumption that its anchor tenant was a partner. It turned out the relationship was a bit more one-sided than that. Negotiations followed. Pennsylvania state officials joined Allegheny County in trying to work out a deal that would reduce landing fees and debt obligations, enough to keep U.S. Airways committed to Pittsburgh. For a while, it seemed possible. U.S. Airways committed to maintaining its hub schedule through Labor Day 2004 while talks continued. The talks ultimately failed. In December 2004, after filing for bankruptcy a second time in September of that year, U.S. Airways announced it would be reducing operations at Pittsburgh and shifting its hub focus to Charlotte and Philadelphia. The announcement wasn't entirely surprising. It was, however, the formal beginning of a very long, very painful decline. The ghost airport. Within a year of the announcement, U.S. Airways had eliminated 7,000 jobs at Pittsburgh while cutting its daily operations to roughly 200 flights. A year after that, it was down to about 170 flights per day. The cuts kept coming throughout the decade. By 2010, U.S. Airways was running only about 68 daily flights to and from Pittsburgh, a fraction of the more than 500 the hub had been handling at its peak in the late 1990s. What had been described as 1,400 to 1,500 daily operations, departures and arrivals combined, was now a ghost of itself. The physical consequences inside the airport were surreal to witness. The X-shaped airside terminal, designed to accommodate 100 gates, began going dark. U.S. Airways closed Concourse E in the landside building and a portion of Concourse A in the airside terminal. Wide, well-lit corridors that had once been packed with connecting passengers fell silent. The underground tram, which had carried roughly 8 million passengers annually at its busiest, now shuttled far fewer people through far emptier gates. Stores in the air mall shuttered. Restaurants closed. The infrastructure that had been built for one of the busiest hubs in the eastern United States was now operating at a fraction of its intended capacity. One writer at the time described the experience of walking through the vast, echoing terminal as a reminder that the airport had been built for a model of air travel that no longer exists here. That description was kind. In practical terms, the airport felt like a theme park that had lost its main attraction and hadn't quite figured out what to do with all the empty space. Worse than the optics was the balance sheet. The county, meanwhile, was still paying the debt. With U.S. Airways no longer covering its share, the Allegheny County Airport Authority scrambled to find alternate revenue. State aid tied to gaming revenues was deployed to help plug the holes. When that wasn't enough, officials discovered the airport was sitting on something valuable they hadn't planned for. The property was located directly above the Marcellus Shale Formation, one of the most productive natural gas deposits in North America. The authority began leasing airport land to drilling operations, using revenue pumped out of the earth to cover the cost of a terminal that an airline had walked away from. There's something almost poetic about that, if you're in the mood for dark poetry. Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald put it plainly in a 2021 interview. That was a second devastating economic blow after steel in the early 80s. For a city that had already survived the obliteration of its industrial base once, watching the airport slowly empty out must have felt uncomfortably familiar. The fares problem. One detail that often gets lost in the story of U.S. Airways' dominance at Pittsburgh is what it actually costs people to fly there. When a single airline controls 90% of a market, competition vanishes, and so does any pressure to keep prices reasonable. Pittsburgh consistently ranked among the most expensive airports in the country for fares throughout the 1990s. Families living in western Pennsylvania who needed to travel westward could save hundreds of dollars per ticket simply by driving to Cleveland or Buffalo and flying from there instead. This wasn't a secret. In October 1995, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a front-page story headlined "Fair or Foul," documenting exactly how U.S. Airways' near monopoly was costing local passengers. The situation was so well known that it bordered on accepted. This was the deal Pittsburgh had made: a gleaming, state-of-the-art airport in exchange for handing a single airline total market control. When U.S. Airways eventually left, the high fares left with it. Southwest Airlines arrived in May 2005, and discount competition quickly drove prices down. Local passengers who had been paying premium fares for decades suddenly had affordable options. The airport's recovery, when it finally came, was in no small part a story about what happens when a monopoly loses its grip. The slow comeback. The years following U.S. Airways' pullout were difficult, but Pittsburgh International didn't roll over quietly. Airport officials aggressively courted new carriers, offering financial incentives to airlines willing to enter the Pittsburgh market. Southwest's arrival in May 2005 was the single most significant inflection point in the airport's post-hub history. The low-cost carrier brought genuine price competition to a market that had been monopolized for nearly 2 decades, drove fares down substantially, and grew its presence steadily year after year. By the 2000s, Southwest had overtaken American Airlines, the company that had ultimately absorbed U.S. Airways in a 2013 merger, as the largest carrier at Pittsburgh in terms of passenger volume. The airport authority pursued routes to Los Angeles, Boston, Nashville, Houston, and West Palm Beach, Florida. The number of carriers serving Pittsburgh grew from a handful in the immediate post-U.S. Airways years to 16 by the 2000s, a level of competition the airport had never seen even in its supposedly golden era. For local travelers, the change was tangible. Flying out of Pittsburgh was no longer something you did reluctantly, because the alternative was a 2-hour drive to Cleveland. The debt, meanwhile, was being methodically retired. The airport authority used refinancing, passenger facility charges, gambling revenues, and natural gas income to chip away at what had once been an $800 to $900 million obligation. The per-passenger cost, which had reached as high as $14.97 in 2011, one of the highest in the country, came down steadily as the debt shrank. By 2019, Airport Authority CEO Christina Cassadas announced the airport was paying off the remaining construction debt early, formally closing a financial wound that had been open for nearly 30 years. In 2017, Pittsburgh International made national news for a different reason. It became the first airport in the United States to reopen post-security access to non-ticketed visitors, after the federal government lifted restrictions that had been in place since September 11, 2001. For the first time in 16 years, you could walk a family member all the way to their gate again. It sounds like a small thing. If you've ever stood at a security checkpoint watching someone disappear down the corridor with their carry-on, you'll know it isn't. And in 2021, the airport became the first in the world to achieve full energy self-sufficiency through its own microgrid, powered by natural gas extracted from the Marcellus Shale beneath the airport grounds and supplemented by solar panels. The same gas field that had helped the airport stay financially solvent during its darkest years was now powering its lights. That feels like the kind of detail a screenwriter would add, except that it actually happened. The $1.7 billion rebuild. By the mid-2000s, a different problem had become impossible to ignore. The 1992 terminal, no matter how impressive it had been at opening, was simply the wrong airport for the Pittsburgh of the 21st century. It had been designed for a connecting hub, serving tens of millions of passengers annually. Pittsburgh International now served a primarily local, origin and destination market of around 8 to 9 million passengers per year. The mismatch was enormous. An airport built for 3 times the traffic was expensive to maintain, oddly laid out for modern travelers, and, perhaps most practically inconvenient, required everyone to take an underground tram just to reach their gates. What had once felt like a feature of the future felt by 2015 like a stubborn reminder of the airport's hub era past. The landside terminal, in particular, had aged badly. Parking was inconvenient. The journey from curb to gate was unnecessarily long, and the building itself made no logical sense for an airport that no longer needed to process hundreds of thousands of connecting passengers every month. One industry publication compared the experience to backpacking the Appalachian Trail, simply to get from the car to the plane. As Airport Authority Chairman David Minot noted when new plans were unveiled, the people of Pittsburgh finally get an airport built for them, and not U.S. Air. In 2017, the Allegheny County Airport Authority unveiled a plan for a complete replacement of the landside terminal, a project that ultimately came in at $1.57 billion. The new structure would consolidate ticketing, security, baggage claim, car rental, and a 3,300 space parking garage under one roof, with a direct connection to the existing airside gates. No tram, no lengthy walk through a building designed for a version of this airport that had ceased to exist 2 decades earlier. Construction began in earnest. COVID-19 pushed the timeline back, and on November 18, 2025, the new terminal opened for business. The first departure was a Southwest Airlines flight to Denver, which is either fitting or ironic, depending on how much of this history you've absorbed. The underground tram, which had operated continuously since October 1992, took its last passengers that same evening and was officially decommissioned. 33 years of service, shuttling millions of people back and forth beneath an airport that had changed beyond recognition around it. What the story actually is. Pittsburgh International Airport's story gets told as a disaster story, a $1 billion white elephant, a corporate betrayal, a cautionary tale about putting all your economic eggs in one airline's basket. All of that is accurate, but it's also a story about a city that refused to let that be the end of it. The airport that U.S. Airways left behind sat half empty for the better part of 2 decades. Gates went dark, corridors echoed. The debt piled up while the airline that had created it restructured, merged, and eventually ceased to exist entirely under its own name. U.S. Airways was absorbed into American Airlines in 2013, and when U.S. Airways flew its ceremonial final flight that year, the route didn't stop in Pittsburgh, not even for a farewell toast. The city that had built a billion-dollar airport to the airline's exact specifications didn't even make the goodbye itinerary. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about how that relationship worked, nothing will. For the passengers who had flown through Pittsburgh in the hub years, the decline was visible in a dozen small ways. The tram felt longer. The gates felt farther apart. The air mall shops that had once buzzed with connecting travelers now sat quieter, some of them vacant. There's something odd about an airport that was described as the airport of the future in 1992 and then spent the next decade feeling like a relic from a past that had never quite arrived. Pittsburgh, for its part, eventually figured out what it actually needed: a smaller, more efficient airport built for the passengers who actually lived there. Not a hub, not a monument to a single airline's expansion strategy. Just a functional, well-run airport for the people of Western Pennsylvania. The realization took time and cost money, but it stuck. The new $1.7 billion terminal that opened on November 18, 2025 was financed without a dollar of local tax revenue, paid through airline contributions, passenger facility charges, and natural gas royalties from the Marcellus Shale beneath the airport's own property. The terminal connects directly to the airside gates, eliminating the tram that had defined the passenger experience since 1992. It serves 15 airlines. It is sized for the market that actually exists, not the one that was imagined in 1987. In a way, the new terminal is the first Pittsburgh airport that was designed for Pittsburgh. Not for a steel industry that was about to collapse, not for an airline that was about to walk out, but for the actual people who fly in and out of Western Pennsylvania. That distinction matters more than it might sound. For decades, this airport was a facility shaped by external forces: industry, airlines, debt, and circumstance. The new one, built without public dollars and funded in part by gas wells drilled right beneath the property, was shaped by the community it serves. The rise and fall and eventual second act of Basbanor's of Pittsburgh International Airport is the story of what happens when a city bets its future on a single partner, loses that bet spectacularly, and then has to figure out what to do next. The answer turned out to be keep working, retire the debt, court new partners, and eventually build something better. You just have to carry the weight long enough to get there. Pittsburgh has had some practice at that. If you found this video interesting, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's plenty more history like this where it came from.